The winter wind cut through the bombed-out streets of Birmingham like a blade, howling past shattered windows and curling around corners where rubble still sat in frozen piles. It was February 1945, and England had been at war for more than 5 years. The city bore its scars openly, craters where homes once stood, buildings with their faces torn off, exposing wallpapered rooms to the elements like dollhouses left in the rain. But on this particular night, in a massive warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a different kind of battle was about to begin. Major Charity Adams stood at the entrance of the King Edward School building, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her army coat. Behind her, 754 women filed off trucks and into the darkness, their boots crunching on ice-crusted pavement. They were the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the 6,888, and they were the only all-black Women's Army Corps unit to serve overseas during the Second World War. They had traveled more than 5,000 miles across a submarine-infested Atlantic Ocean to reach this moment, and now they stood before a warehouse that looked less like a military facility and more like a tomb. Major Adams pushed open the heavy door, and the smell hit her first: mildew, decay. The sour stench of rat droppings and waterlogged cardboard. She stepped inside, and her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grimy windows 3 stories up. What she saw made her heart sink. Mountains, actual mountains of mail. Letters, parcels, boxes stacked from floor to ceiling in chaotic, teetering piles that stretched as far as she could see into the shadowed depths of the warehouse. Some packages had been there so long that mold crept across their surfaces like dark frost. Others had burst open, their contents spilled and trampled. Water damage had turned entire sections into papery sludge. Rats scurried boldly between the stacks, unbothered by the arrival of these new intruders. Behind her, Private First Class Lena King stopped so abruptly that 2 women bumped into her back. Lena was 19 years old, from a small town in Georgia where she'd picked cotton alongside her mother before enlisting. She'd joined the WWII believing she could make a difference, could prove something about herself and about black women who were always told what they couldn't do. She'd survived basic training at Fort Oglethorpe, endured the segregated facilities, the hostile stares, the constant reminders that even in uniform she was considered less than. She'd crossed the ocean in a ship where German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, and she'd done it all with her head high and her resolve unshaken. But now, standing in this freezing warehouse looking at what appeared to be years' worth of undelivered mail, she felt something close to despair. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind her. Major Adams turned sharply. Her eyes were hard, her jaw set. When she spoke, her voice carried across the warehouse with the force of a command that brooked no argument. "This is exactly what we came here to do. This is why they sent for us, because every other unit they've thrown at this has failed. Because there are millions of soldiers out there who haven't heard from home in months, maybe years. Because somewhere in these piles are letters telling men their children have been born. Their wives are dying, their parents are praying for them. Somewhere in here are packages with socks and chocolate and photographs. Things that remind these soldiers they have something worth coming home to. We're going to find every single one of them. We're going to sort them, deliver them, and we're going to do it faster and better than anyone thought possible. Is that understood?" The response came back in unison, sharp and clear: "Yes, ma'am." The scope of the disaster was staggering. The European theater of operations had a mail crisis that threatened the very morale of the Allied forces. In February 1945, there were approximately 17 million pieces of backlogged mail sitting in warehouses across England and France. Some of it had been there since 1943. The existing postal system had completely collapsed under the weight of a war that stretched across continents. Millions of American servicemen and women received no mail for months at a time. They fought battles, watched friends die, endured cold and fear and exhaustion, and heard nothing from the people they loved. Letters went missing. Packages disappeared. The system for tracking addresses had broken down so completely that mail was often sent to units that no longer existed or soldiers who had been transferred months earlier. Morale, that invisible but essential fuel of any fighting force, was bleeding out through the cracks of a failed postal operation. Enter the 6,888. They set up operations in 3 8-hour shifts that ran around the clock every day, 7 days a week. The warehouse had no heat. The windows were too high and too filthy to let in much natural light. Floodlights were brought in, humming and flickering, casting harsh shadows across the mountains of correspondence. The women wore every layer they owned. They wrapped their hands in whatever they could find to keep their fingers from going numb. They worked through air raids, racing to their shelters when the sirens wailed, then returning immediately when the all-clear sounded to continue where they'd left off. Lena King found herself assigned to Section C, which handled letters with incomplete or illegible addresses. On her first full shift, she pulled a letter from a pile that had been sitting untouched for 18 months. The envelope was water-stained and torn, the address barely visible. She could make out a name, PFC Robert Smith, and part of a unit designation. Nothing else. In the old system, this letter would have been declared undeliverable and tossed aside. But Major Adams had instituted a new protocol: cross-reference everything, use any scrap of information, check and recheck. The women of the 6888 created their own filing system, developed new methods for tracking soldiers who had been transferred or killed, established connections with other postal units across the theater. They became detectives, puzzle solvers, refusing to give up on any piece of mail that might reach its destination. Lena spent 40 minutes tracking down PFC Robert Smith. She found 3 soldiers by that name in the European theater. She cross-referenced the partial unit number with transfer records. She narrowed it down to one man, a soldier from Ohio serving with an artillery unit in France. She forwarded the letter with updated routing information. 2 weeks later, she received word that the letter had been delivered. It was from the soldier's mother, written the day before she died of pneumonia. The man had been trying for over a year to find out if she'd received his letters, if she knew he was alive. That single piece of mail, pulled from the chaos by a 19-year-old woman from Georgia, had answered questions that had haunted him through 2 years of combat. Multiply that story by millions, and you begin to understand what the 6888 accomplished. Oh, the work was brutal. Sorting mail required standing for 8 hours straight, pulling packages and letters from towering stacks, reading faded handwriting by inadequate light, cross-referencing names against constantly updated rosters. The women's hands cracked and bled from the cold and the rough handling of thousands of pieces of mail. They breathed air thick with dust and mold spores. They dodged rats the size of cats that had made the warehouse their home. They worked through exhaustion, through illness, through homesickness and doubt. And they did it while knowing that back home in America, they were still second-class citizens. They couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white soldiers. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants. Many of their families couldn't vote. Yet here they were, working themselves to the bone to ensure that white soldiers received letters from home, because the mission mattered more than the injustice. Staff Sergeant Charity Early, a 32-year-old woman from Philadelphia who had been a school teacher before the war, organized a team that specialized in handling the most damaged mail. These were packages and letters that had been bombed, waterlogged, burned, or otherwise destroyed to the point that conventional sorting seemed impossible. Charity's team painstakingly reconstructed addresses from fragments. They dried out soggy letters page by page. They transferred the contents of destroyed packages into new containers with meticulous documentation. They saved thousands of pieces of mail that would otherwise have been thrown away. One evening, working the midnight shift under flickering floodlights, Charity opened a package that had been blown apart by shrapnel during a bombing raid. Inside the torn cardboard, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously stayed intact, she found a child's drawing. It showed a stick-figure soldier holding hands with a stick-figure girl. Above them, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "Come home safe, Daddy. I miss you. Love, Sarah." The package had no legible address remaining. Charity sat there in the freezing warehouse with that drawing in her hands, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Somewhere out there was a soldier who needed to see this. Somewhere was a little girl who needed him to know she was thinking of him. Charity spent her entire shift and half of the next tracking down that soldier. She found fragments of a name on the destroyed package, SGT James Hen, and part of an APO number. She worked with her team to identify every James Henderson, James Henry, and James Henley in the European theater. She cross-referenced the partial APO number with unit deployments. She finally found him. Sergeant James Henderson of the 101st Airborne, stationed in France. She sent the drawing with a note explaining how it had survived. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the warehouse addressed to the women who saved my daughter's picture. In it, Sergeant Henderson wrote that he had been on the edge of breaking, that he'd seen too much death, and couldn't remember why he was fighting anymore. That drawing reminded him. It gave him a reason to keep going. He thanked them for caring enough to find him when it would have been so much easier to throw it all away. The women of the 6888 kept that letter posted on a wall in the warehouse, and when the work seemed impossible, when the piles seemed endless, when the cold seeped so deep into their bones that they thought they'd never be warm again, they looked at it and remembered why they were there. The statistics alone are staggering. The 6888. 8 cleared the backlog in Birmingham in just 3 months, a task that military officials had estimated would take at least 6 months, possibly years. They processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. Working around the clock in 3 shifts, that meant they were handling nearly 200,000 pieces of mail every single day. They devised a new system for tracking personnel, creating a card file with information on every soldier in the European theater. When the Army tried to send them only undeliverable mail after Birmingham, Major Adams pushed back, insisting her unit could handle all mail routing if given the chance. They were transferred to Rouen, France, where another massive backlog awaited them. They cleared it in 3 weeks. But the numbers, impressive as they are, can't capture the human impact. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe approached its end, American soldiers began reporting something remarkable. They were getting mail again. Letters from home that they'd written off as lost forever suddenly appeared. Packages sent for Christmas. 1944 arrived in time for Easter 1945. Soldiers learned they'd become fathers, that their parents were proud of them, that their sweethearts were waiting. The psychological impact was profound. Commanders reported improved morale across their units. Soldiers who had seemed defeated, hollowed out by months of combat, suddenly had energy again. They had hope. They remembered what they were fighting for. It wasn't just about delivering good news. Many soldiers received letters informing them of deaths, divorces, financial troubles back home. But even terrible news was better than silence. Even grief was better than not knowing. The women of the 688 understood this. They handled every piece of mail, no matter how routine or how devastating, with the same care and urgency, because they understood what it meant to be far from home, to be treated as less than, to wonder if anyone remembered you existed. The conditions they endured went beyond the physical challenges of the work. They faced discrimination from white American soldiers who resented their presence, who couldn't accept that black women in uniform were accomplishing what white men had failed to do. They faced hostility from some British locals who had absorbed American segregationist attitudes. They faced doubt from their own commanders, many of whom had opposed allowing black women to serve overseas in the first place. Major Charity Adams, the unit's commanding officer, dealt with constant skepticism and interference. On one occasion, a white male general attempted to inspect her troops without following proper protocol, essentially trying to undermine her command. Major Adams stood her ground, informing him that he would not inspect her women unless he followed the same procedures required for any other commanding officer. It was an act of remarkable courage in an era when a black woman challenging a white male general could face severe consequences. The general backed down. The 688 earned a reputation for excellence that eventually silenced even their harshest critics. Private Lena King discovered something about herself in that freezing warehouse in Birmingham. She discovered that she was stronger than she'd known, that she could push through exhaustion and cold and doubt to accomplish something that mattered. She discovered that the work of her hands, sorting letters, tracking addresses, connecting soldiers with the people who loved them, was as vital to the war effort as firing a gun or flying a plane, maybe more vital, because what good was winning battles if the soldiers fighting them lost their humanity in the process? What good was defeating fascism abroad if you returned to a country that denied your basic dignity at home? These were questions the women of the 688 asked themselves during those long months in England and France. They had volunteered to serve a country that did not fully recognize their citizenship. They had put their lives at risk crossing an ocean full of enemy submarines. They had worked themselves to exhaustion in service of a military that segregated them, that paid them less than their white counterparts, that would send them home to a nation where they still couldn't vote in many states, couldn't eat in many restaurants, couldn't live in many neighborhoods. Yet they served with honor, with excellence, with a determination to prove that they belonged, that they mattered, that they could do anything they set their minds to. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The 688 continued working, processing the flood of mail that came with victory, soldiers writing home to say they'd survived, families writing to ask when their boys would come home, the endless correspondence of an army preparing to demobilize. The unit was eventually transferred to Paris, where they continued their mission before finally being sent home in early 1946. They returned to America with a remarkable record, the only women's Army Corps unit of their size to receive no disciplinary actions during their entire deployment. They had served with distinction, cleared backlogs that had defeated other units, and restored the communication lines that kept an army's morale alive during the darkest days of the war. And then they were forgotten. No parades greeted them. No medals were immediately forthcoming. They returned to an America that was still deeply segregated, still unwilling to acknowledge the contributions of black women in uniform. Many of them took off their uniforms and went back to lives where they were expected to step off the sidewalk when white people passed, where they couldn't try on clothes in department stores, where they were addressed by their first names by people half their age simply because their skin was dark. The official military histories of World War II barely mentioned them. Textbooks ignored them. The story of the 6888 became a footnote. Then, less than a footnote, it became a silence. Decades passed. The women of the 6888 grew older. Some of them told their stories to their children and grandchildren. Most found that people didn't believe them. You served overseas in World War II in the Army? That can't be right. They didn't let women do that. They certainly didn't let black women do that. The erasure was so complete that their own descendants sometimes doubted their memories. It wasn't until 2019 that the 6888 received proper recognition when a monument was dedicated to them at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In 2022, some of the surviving members finally received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor a Congress can bestow. By then, only a handful of the original 755 women were still alive. Major Charity Adams had passed away in 2002, Staff Sergeant Charity Early in 2002, Private First Class Lena King in 2018. They died without seeing their contributions fully recognized, without seeing their story told in history books, without hearing the thanks of a nation that owed them so much. But their legacy lives on in ways both seen and unseen. It lives in the letters they delivered, in the morale they restored, in the connections they maintained between soldiers and the families who loved them. It lives in the example they set for generations of women who followed them into military service. It lives in the proof they provided that black women could excel at any task, could overcome any obstacle, could serve their country with distinction, even when that country failed to serve them with justice. The story of the 6888 is ultimately a story about the power of communication in wartime. Military historians often focus on battles, on tactics and strategy, on the movements of armies across maps. But wars are fought by human beings who need to feel connected to something beyond the horror surrounding them. A letter from home can be the difference between a soldier who finds the strength to keep going and one who gives up. A package containing nothing more than cookies and socks can remind someone why they're fighting. News of a birth, a wedding, a graduation, these small pieces of normalcy become lifelines in a world turned upside down by violence. The women of the 6888 understood this instinctively. They didn't see their work as mere mail sorting. They saw it as saving lives. They saw it as preserving the bonds between soldiers and civilians, between fighting men and the nation they represented, between individuals and their hope for a future beyond war. They worked with urgency because they knew that every day's delay meant soldiers going without news from home, meant questions unanswered, meant loneliness deepening into despair. They worked with care because they knew that the envelope they held might contain the last words a dying parent would send. The first announcement of a new life, the difference between a soldier who survived and one who gave up. In a freezing warehouse in Birmingham, England, in the winter of 1945, 755 black women in army uniforms saved a war with letters. They took chaos and created order. They took despair and created hope. They took millions of pieces of paper and transformed them into lifelines stretching across an ocean, across a continent, across the distance between death and home. They did it while facing discrimination, while enduring conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. While knowing they would receive no immediate recognition for their sacrifice, they did it anyway because the work mattered, because the soldiers mattered, because proving what black women could accomplish mattered, because honor and duty and service meant something even when the nation they served didn't fully recognize their humanity. This is the story that should be taught in every school, remembered in every history book, honored in every conversation about World War II. This is the story of the 6888 who saved a war with letters and received only silence in return. But silence doesn't erase truth. Forgetting doesn't undo achievement. And eventually, if we're lucky, if we're persistent, if we refuse to let these stories disappear, justice finds its way to those who deserved it all along. The women of the 6888 earned their place in history not just by what they accomplished, but by how they accomplished it, with grace under pressure, with excellence despite discrimination, with dignity in the face of dismissal. They saved a war with letters, and in doing so, they saved a piece of America's soul.